Hey everybody, this is Dr. Hathcock, and this is your review for Exam 4, which again is going to be online. Don't forget that. This is for the History 1302 class in the fall of 2022. Okay, so this exam is going to deal with the Cold War, the 1950s, the Civil Rights Struggle, and the 1960s, the Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson administrations anyways. Okay, so as always, you're going to need to know your presidents. This test really, it's more about Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson. Let's see, you're going to need to know the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which eliminated the poll tax as well. Let me just go through this and we'll see if anything else pops in my head. But okay, so U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. It's about the policy of containment, which was put forward by Mr. George Kennan. You might also remember that that becomes the Truman Doctrine once it's officially embraced by President Truman. And it was all that idea that we were going to stop the further spread of communism around the world. So really the policy of containment is America's foreign policy throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Let's see, the war in Korea. So there's a lot of back and forth in that war. North Korea was a communist nation. It was backed by the Russians and then the Chinese. So you'll recall that when China fell to communism, President Truman was forced to reaffirm our commitment to the Truman Doctrine. And his embarrassment at the fall of China to communism meant that he wasn't going to let another nation fall into communist hands. So when North Korea attacked South Korea, Truman was determined to defend South Korea and keep it from falling into communist hands. You'll remember that Douglas MacArthur gets involved. He pulls off an amazing event with the Incheon landings, effectively destroys the North Korean army. At that point, MacArthur is convincing President Truman that the U.S. UN forces could march north, could take out North Korea, could liberate the entire peninsula. Truman takes the bait. U.S. UN forces march north into North Korea. We're winning the battle, really, we're taking over. But then the Chinese threaten to intervene. Go back and look at your notes where MacArthur started to defy presidential orders, started talking about using nuclear weapons. So Truman fired MacArthur. Then the Chinese intervene. The whole situation crumbles and falls apart. But the United States does manage to sort of stop the bleeding, stop the Chinese advance. A stalemate of sorts emerges. But North Korea and South Korea stabilized their lines along the 38th parallel. And I guess you can say that technically the policy of containment did work in Korea, but South Korea did not fall into communist hands. Okay, Eisenhower's dynamic conservatism, it was that idea that he was liberal when it came to helping people live their everyday lives, but he was also conservative when it came to things like the military, law and order, and the Constitution. And remember those examples I gave you of his dynamic conservatism. The Tidewater oil lands was an example of his being conservative, and the Federal Highway Project was the example I gave of his being very liberal. Okay, the affluence of 1950s America. So when Eisenhower was president and America was going through this this consumer-driven economy, the country had everything that it could ever want. Plenty food, medical supplies, more electricity, more products that ran off of electricity. So I swear in your outline there's just a whole PowerPoint where it talks about the affluence of 1950s America. It talked about the rise of suburbia, the baby boomers, all of that sort of stuff. Let's see, Cold War incidents. I swear that's what this last part of the topic's all about, but the Berlin blockade, which was countered by a Berlin airlift. I'm probably going to forget something, but I'm just trying to remember everything I can here. I don't know, Sputnik. let's see, the U-2 spy plane incident, the Cuban Revolution where Castro takes over, the various summits, the Geneva summit, for example. Oh man, just trying to think of other things. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a huge Cold War incident of note. Okay, so the U.S. government and the Civil Rights Crusade. So with Brown v. Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court signals that it is for desegregation. It is opposed to segregation. But then in the Congress, there's sort of a battle as you have Southern congressmen come together to form the Southern Manifesto. So there's a battle within Congress as to whether or not the legislative branch is on board with civil rights. And it turns out that it really would ultimately come down to presidents and whether or not there'd be a president who was for desegregation opposed to Jim Crow. Eisenhower didn't do too much. He did do, he did send the 101st Airborne Division in for the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. John F. Kennedy didn't do much either, but it turns out Lyndon Johnson was the guy who would start things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So at the end of the day, you say that the judicial branch supported desegregation, the legislative branch was fighting within itself, and ultimately the executive branch did come around to the idea of desegregation. Let's see, the Montgomery bus boycott. So go back and look in your notes where I talked about Rosa Parks refused to give her seat up. That led to her arrest and then the boycott of the busing system there in Montgomery, Alabama. Within that, you also had the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a civil rights leader. Ultimately, the bus boycott was effective. It did work. The city of Montgomery did cave, and it desegregated its buses. But the main thing coming out of the Montgomery bus boycott was Dr. King's rise, his formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and his nonviolent protest against segregation. Okay, civil rights legislation and politics. Really what I'm trying to get at there more than anything is go back and look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and how, Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, even though he knew it was going to cost a lot of Southern support for the Democratic Party going forward. All right, let's see. Foreign crises during the JFK administration. Bay of Pigs was a bit of a problem. Go back and look at the failed CIA plan for the invasion of Cuba. Let's see. The Vienna summit didn't go very well. The meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, where a very aggressive Khrushchev was trying to make certain demands that he thought he could get away with. But really the biggest one of all, well, the building of the Berlin Wall happened as well. But the biggest one of all is that Cuban Missile Crisis that happens there in October of 1962. Speaking of which, the next point is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So U-2 spy flight going over Cuba takes high-resolution photographs of Soviet missile installations being put into the island of Cuba. The United States couldn't allow for that to come to be, so President Kennedy calls for a quarantine of the island of Cuba. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. It really looked like the world was possibly on the brink of a nuclear war. But then it turns out that both countries could compromise on the issue. Let's go back and look at what the compromises were. And also there were some big results coming out of it. Less tension between the two nations, the banning of atmospheric nuclear testing, hotline installed between our two countries, and really that John F. Kennedy was a lock for a re-election in 1964 after the way he handled this episode. You and I know John F. Kennedy was assassinated tragically in November of 1963. At that point, Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president of the United States. We talked about how he vowed to carry out President Kennedy's legacy. He did do that through the space race and civil rights legislation. But then Lyndon Johnson also had his own policies and ideas that are referred to as the Great Society. So go back and look at Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, his work and passage of Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and things like that. Okay, I can't really think of anything else off the top of my head. This is an online exam, but it's like every exam you've taken so far. It's going to have 20 multiple choice, 10 fill in the blanks, and you'll get to choose to write one of 2 possible essays. So yeah, there you go. Study up. Wish you the best of luck, and bye.